The wind screamed like a wounded animal that night, tearing through the half-repaired cabin with a fury that made the wooden beams groan. Snow fell sideways, thick as wool, blinding the world beyond the frosted windows and burying the land in a suffocating silence. Inside, Emma Holt swung her axe with relentless rhythm, her breath pluming in the frigid air like ghostly smoke. Each strike of the blade against frozen wood echoed the ache in her shoulders, a rhythm born of necessity, not rage. Her skirts were tucked high, boots buried ankle-deep in white drifts, her hands chapped and raw from labor. She didn't glance back at the cabin, though she knew Hannah and Tony pressed against the glass, their small faces pale moons of worry. The fire inside flickered low, its warmth rationed like gold. As the twins sat cross-legged on the floor, their silence broken only by the crackle of pine wood and the distant howl of the storm. Emma's husband had died last spring, drunk beneath his wagon near Copper Ridge, leaving her with debts, a crumbling homestead, and the unspoken truth that loneliness could hollow a person faster than grief. His grave lay 50 feet from the porch, a crude wooden marker bowed under snow. When she finally stepped inside, the storm seemed to follow her. The door hissed shut, and snow melted off her coat in sizzling drips. But the storm wasn't done. A faint sound pierced the quiet, a groan, thin and broken, not from the wind but from something human. Emma froze, her pulse sharpening. Years on the frontier had taught her to fear the silence more than wolves, more than raiders. Her husband's ghost seemed to whisper warnings from the grave. Danger comes quiet. She grabbed her hunting knife and lantern, the weight of both familiar, and stepped into the blizzard. The wind clawed at her shawl, the lantern's light barely carving a trembling gold circle in the dark. She moved past the barn, toward the edge of the corral where the sound had come from. There he was, half buried in snow, like a forgotten scarecrow dropped by the wind. Blood stained the white around him, spreading slow like rust and water. His face was turned to the side, and in the flickering light, she saw copper-toned skin, high cheekbones, dark hair tangled with frost. A Comanche raider. Her breath caught. Not from fear, not entirely. He wasn't moving. One arm was bent beneath him, the other stretched out as if he'd crawled the last yards on sheer will. His chest rose in shallow jerks. Leave him, she told herself. Let nature finish what violence began. Her husband's grave sat not 50 feet away, a cold reminder of how trust could curdle into betrayal. She could not explain what made her crouch beside him, her fingers brushing his neck for a pulse, faint, hot, stubborn. Hannah's voice carried on the wind from the cabin. "Ma." Emma looked toward the lighted window, her children waiting, and whispered to the man in the snow, "I ain't doing this for you. I'm doing it for them." Dragging him was like pulling stone through the storm. Two shadows stitched by need and chance, disappearing into the blizzard and emerging again, until Emma heaved the man onto the floor near the fire. The children gasped at the sight of him, bloodied, half frozen, his breath shallow. Hannah obeyed without question when told to fetch clean rags and whiskey, her small hands trembling as she handed them over. Tony hovered nearby, wide-eyed, whispering, "Is he bad?" Emma said nothing. She cut away the crusted shirt, revealing skin marred by old scars and a fresh wound near his ribs. He was lean, built like a hawk, nothing wasted, everything honed. She poured whiskey across the gash. His breath hitched sharply, a low groan escaping his throat. One eye opened, a flicker of amber sharp and clouded with pain. He met her gaze for a moment, confusion dancing there like smoke. Then he passed out again, his body going slack. Emma sat back, wiping her hands on her skirt. The storm raged outside, wind clawing at the shutters, but the fire hissed steadily, melting snow from his lashes. She looked at her children, Hannah clutching the rags, Tony biting his lip, and then at the stranger who had bled into her home. This changed everything but she didn't know how not yet. Only that the wind no longer sounded quite so empty. Emma crouched beside the raider, her breath fogging the air as she pressed trembling fingers to his neck. The pulse beneath her skin was faint but stubborn, a flicker of life against the cold. His fever burned hot, a fever that felt like rebellion against the snow, soaking his clothes and hair. Blood seeped from a jagged tear near his ribs, dark and sticky, staining the white around him like ink spilled on parchment. She knew his kind. Raiders who moved like shadows across the plains, killers whispered about in fireside warnings, ghosts her husband had sworn would one day come for them. Yet here he was, broken but breathing, his chest rising in shallow, uneven hitches, like a mountain enduring a fire that refused to consume it whole. Hannah's voice drifted from the cabin again, thin and uncertain. "Ma." Emma hesitated, her hand hovering over the knife at her belt. The storm howled, as if urging her to decide. Finally, she sheathed the blade with a sharp click. "I ain't doing this for you," she whispered to the unconscious man, her voice low and raw. Dragging him was like hauling a sack of stones through sludge. Snow clung to his limp form, weighing him down, each step a battle against the drifts and her own doubt. The children gasped when she heaved him onto the floor near the fire, their eyes wide as lantern light caught the blood crusted on his skin. "Clean rags. Whiskey," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. Hannah obeyed without a word, her small hands trembling as she fetched supplies. Tony hovered nearby, his face pale, eyes locked on the stranger like he might vanish or lash out. "Is he bad?" the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. Emma didn't answer. She cut away the soaked shirt, revealing old scars and fresh wounds. His lean frame taut with tension even in unconsciousness. She poured whiskey into the gash, the sting sharp enough to make her wince. The man's breath hitched. One amber eye flickered open, clouded with pain, searching hers for a heartbeat before slipping shut again. Outside, the storm raged, wind clawing at the shutters. Inside, the fire hissed as snow melted off his lashes in slow droplets. Emma wiped her hands on her skirt, the smell of whiskey and blood thick in the air. She stared at the children, at the stranger, at the chaos she'd invited in. Hannah clutched the rag, her knuckles white. Tony bit his lip, eyes darting between his mother and the man who'd once seemed like a monster. Emma's mind raced. This changed everything. Her husband's grave lay just beyond the porch, a silent witness to her choice. She'd buried trust with him, yet here she was, stitching another life into theirs with rough hands and no promises. The firelight cast long shadows, blurring the line between savior and stranger. For now, there was only the sound of breath, the weight of silence, and the unspoken truth that survival, once again, had come at a cost. By dawn, the storm had softened into silence. The cabin sat half-buried in white, its chimney whispering smoke into a pale sky. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting golden flickers over the room. Emma sat cross-legged near the hearth, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands stained with dried blood and the ache of decision. Levi Stone. He'd murmured his name hours ago, a whisper like smoke, tossed beneath the quilts, his fevered sleep restless. Sweat beaded on his brow, mixing with melted snow in his hair. Hannah crouched nearby, her chin resting on her knees, studying him like a puzzle she could piece together if she stared long enough. Tony sat against the wall, chewing a loose thread from his sleeve, eyes darting between his mother and the stranger. Emma pressed a cool rag to Levi's forehead. He stirred, his breath hitching as the cloth met his skin. His lips parted, a whisper escaping. "Emma." She froze. Not a threat, not a curse, just her name, roughened by his tongue, but unmistakable. Her chest tightened. Names were not given lightly here. They carried weight, like promises or debts. She said nothing, just folded the rag and pressed it again, watching his face for signs of pain, of deceit. He did not wake. Later, she stepped outside to check the livestock. The barn held, the roof intact, the cow lowing softly in the cold. Chickens clucked, feathers puffed like mittens. When she returned, Snow clinging to her shawl, Levi was awake. He pushed himself onto one elbow, movements slow and deliberate, testing his strength. "Don't," she said, crossing the room. He blinked at her, his gaze clearer now, the fever's fog lifting. He pointed at his chest, tapping once, then said, "Levi." She repeated it slowly, rolling the syllables like a stone in her palm. He nodded. No words, but names were a start. That night, Hannah placed her wooden rabbit beside him. It was a simple carving, worn smooth by small hands, its ears chipped from years of play. Levi stared at it, then at her. Hannah met his gaze, unblinking, her small face serious. "He's not bad," she said later, curling into her blanket. Emma didn't answer. She didn't know what he was, raider, survivor, ghost, but she knew he hadn't raised a hand to them. Not yet. Not ever. She watched him sleep, his breathing steady, the firelight softening the sharp lines of his face. Outside, the wind sighed, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth. Trust, she thought, was a slow thing, but it had begun. Over the next days, Levi's presence settled into the rhythm of the cabin like a second heartbeat. He learned the children's silences, the way Hannah hummed to herself when drawing, how Tony tapped his foot when nervous. Emma noticed he never startled at sudden noises, but his eyes tracked movement like a man used to threats. He moved with purpose, even in small acts, stacking firewood evenly, sharpening knives with care, mending the torn hem of Hannah's dress without being asked. One afternoon, while Emma patched Tony's coat, she caught Levi watching her hands, his own fingers mimicking her stitching motions in the air. When she handed him the needle and thread, he threaded it clumsily, but tried, his brow furrowed in concentration. The first true moment of understanding came at dusk. Emma stood by the window, peeling potatoes, when Levi approached the table where Hannah drew on scrap cloth with charcoal. He studied her lines, a stick figure family, the cabin, a bird, and pointed at the bird. "Levi," he asked, tilting his head. Hannah shook her head. "That's a robin," she said. He repeated the word, then tapped his chest. "Levi." Hannah nodded. "You're not a bird." He smiled faintly, the first real one Emma had seen, and tapped the charcoal. "Robin," he said, then the bird, then himself. "Levi." Hannah grinned. "Yes. Names." Emma turned back to the window, her throat tight. Names. Bridges between worlds. At night, they spoke without words. Levi carved a wooden bird for Hannah, its wings rough but recognizable. Tony showed him how to tie a fishing knot, fingers guiding his larger ones. Emma found Levi sitting alone by the fire one evening, staring at the flames, his scars catching the light like old rivers. She sat beside him, offering a mug of weak coffee. He took it, sipped, and gestured to the horizon beyond the window. "Nama," he said. She frowned. "Nama." He nodded, tapping the mug. "Enough," he said, then mimed filling it again and pointed to her. "Full." She understood. Enough. Full. A word for when the silence wasn't empty anymore. She echoed it back, and he smiled again, slower this time. The thaw deepened. Ice melted from the eaves in long, weeping drips. One morning, Emma woke to find Levi outside, splitting logs with steady precision. His movements were fluid, his shirt soaked with sweat, the wound on his side pale and closed. When he saw her, he paused, wiped his brow, and held up a piece of wood. "For kindling," he said, the words still stiff but improving. She nodded. "Thank you." He tilted his head, then added, "You sleep well?" She blinked. A question, a small one but a bridge. "Yes," she said. "And you?" He hesitated, then touched his chest. "Nama." Enough. She let the word settle between them like a promise. By the time the snow vanished entirely, Levi had become part of the land itself, silent, enduring, necessary. The children no longer flinched when he moved. Emma no longer checked the knife by her bed. When Hannah asked why he stayed, Emma simply said, "He chooses to." That was enough. For now. Days passed, slow and steady, as the fever broke on the third night. Levi woke soaked in sweat, his breath shaking like a leaf in wind. Emma sat beside him, silent, peeling away damp bandages with practiced care. His wound had closed, leaving a jagged line of pink flesh, but the fever's ghost lingered in his eyes. She fed him broth, lifting the cup to his lips until his hands steadied enough to hold it himself. He never asked why she cared. He only watched, studied the way she moved, the way she tucked the children into their bed, the way her fingers brushed the knife handle when she thought no one was looking. One evening, as the fire dimmed and the children slept curled beneath quilts, he said her name, Emma. It came rough, like a stone dragged over cloth, but deliberate. She looked up from mending Tony's coat, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Snow whispered against the window, and the cabin felt smaller, warmer, as if the walls had drawn inward to hold the quiet. "Yes," she said, holding his gaze. He looked away then, toward the fire, as if the word had cost him something he could not name. By morning, he sat upright, shoulders hunched but determined. The fever had hollowed him, leaving his cheeks sharp and his hands trembling, but his resolve was unbroken. He gestured to the door, "Walk." Emma shook her head. Another day. He nodded once, no protest, no frustration. That surprised her. Not weakness, but trust. A quiet surrender to her judgment. Later, while he dozed near the fire, Emma knitted Tony's coat, her needle clicking in rhythm. She glanced at Levi, his scars, thin and precise, mapped his arms like trails. His calloused palms rested open, unarmed. She wondered what world had carved him. Battles with men, or the slow erosion of time. Had he loved someone here, in this land of snow and silence? Or had he fled something darker than raiders? Her eyes lingered on the knife scar along his jaw, the way it pulled taut when he breathed. Stories lived there, but he kept them buried. A knock startled her from her thoughts. 3 sharp raps at the door. She recognized the rhythm. Amos Holt, rough-chinned and suspicious, always sniffing for weakness. She opened the door just enough to see his weathered face. "Heard tracks near your barn," he said, eyes narrowing at the crack between them. "Thought you'd want to know." Emma held the door firm. "Wolves," she lied, voice flat. "Left prints in the snow." He squinted past her, toward the firelight flickering over Levi's still form. "Someone in there?" She didn't flinch. "My brother's boy." Passing through. Amos studied her, his jaw working like he tasted the lie. "You ought to be careful. Comanche raiders been spotted south of here. If you're hiding something, I'm not," she cut in, calm as a still pond. He lingered, then spat into the snow. "Well, let me know if you need help." She shut the door before he finished. Inside, Levi hadn't stirred, or maybe he had, pretending not to. Either way, the silence between them thickened, heavy with unspoken truths. Later, as the fire burned low, Emma sat beside him, handing him a fresh cup of broth. "They'll come," she said quietly. He met her eyes, amber and steady. "Then we'll be ready. No bravado, no fear. Just a promise woven into the quiet." Outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of thawing earth. The storm had passed, but another loomed. For now, they had this. The fire, the children, the unspoken pact that neither would break. The wind moaned faintly through the cracks in the walls, a reminder of the world beyond. But inside, the firelight held it at bay. Emma sipped her own broth, the warmth spreading through her chest as she watched Levi's hands steady around the cup. He drank slowly, his gaze drifting to Hannah's wooden rabbit on the table, Tony's mended coat draped over a chair. Small things, but they anchored him. She saw it in the way his shoulders eased, how his breath no longer carried the edge of tension. Trust, she thought, was a slow thing, but had begun. Spring crept in, thawing the land with slow, deliberate warmth. Ice dripped from the eaves in long, weeping strands, and the earth softened beneath layers of mud and melting snow. Levi moved to a corner near the hearth, weaving a mat from stripped pine boughs. His fingers worked with quiet precision, splitting and twisting the greenery into patterns only he understood. He never turned his back to the children, not fully, always keeping them in his line of sight. Never lingered too long in one place, as if testing the limits of his welcome. But he carved Hannah a bracelet of dried grass, binding it with twine until it sat snug on her wrist. He taught Tony to knot fishing line, guiding the boy's hands through the loops until the snare held firm. Emma found herself watching them. Levi's quiet strength, the way he handled Broken, would like it deserved a second chance. She noticed how he avoided speaking of his past, how his eyes tracked distant sounds, as if expecting shadows to rise. One day, while mending a torn sack, she asked, "Why did you stay?" He hesitated, needle still in his hand. "They gave me name. Not Savage. Not Ghost. Just Levi." She nodded, the answer settling like dust on a shelf. Not an explanation, but a truth. That night, Amos returned, riding up to the porch with the slow confidence of a man who thought he belonged there. His boots thudded against the planks as he dismounted, eyes narrowing at the sight of Levi's coat hanging by the door. "Strange tracks near the river," he said, voice casual but sharp. Emma stepped out, hands loose at her sides, rifle still behind the door. "Cold lingers," she replied, meeting his gaze. He spat into the dirt. This land got its own ways of healing. His eyes flicked to the cabin window, where Hannah's face vanished behind a curtain. "That nephew still here?" She didn't blink. "He's helping." No lie, just a truth bent to fit her will. Amos studied her, jaw working, then mounted his horse. "You're a stubborn woman, Emma." She watched him ride off, spine stiff until the dust settled. Inside, Levi sat still by the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. The blade caught the light, flashing silver across his knuckles. Emma said quietly, "You're not the danger here." He nodded, but it was the kind of nod that carried sorrow. A man who knew danger followed him like a shadow, even if it wasn't his own making. Over the next days, the thaw deepened. Levi cleared the garden plot, breaking clumps of earth with a hoe he'd repair himself. Emma worked beside him, planting onions in neat rows, while Tony dug holes too wide, too shallow. Hannah trailed them, collecting stones to stack into crooked towers. The rhythm of chores became a language. Levi's silence, Emma's steady hands, the children's laughter when Tony tripped over a root. But the land was not the only thing thawing. One evening, as Emma lit the lantern, she found Levi watching her, his gaze lingering on the way her hair caught the flame's glow. He looked away quickly, but not before she saw the flicker of something unspoken. That night, she handed him the wooden whistle he'd carved, its surface smooth from handling. "Play it," she said. He hesitated, then lifted it to his lips. The note was thin, wavering, but not sad. Hannah stirred in her sleep. Tony mumbled a dream. Outside, the wind sighed, carrying the scent of damp soil and coming rain. When Amos came again, it was not alone. 2 riders followed him, their faces hard, their rifles slung low. Emma stepped onto the porch, hands empty but firm. "More tracks near the creek," Amos said, voice tight. "Saw signs of camp." She folded her arms. "This land's full of signs. You looking for ghosts?" The broader rider spat. "We're looking for truth." Levi stood behind her, silent but present, the weight of his history pressing against the air. Emma didn't flinch. "You'll find none here." The men lingered, eyes darting between her and Levi, then turned their horses back toward the ridge. That night, she found Levi sharpening the same knife again, blade flashing like memory. "They'll come back," she said. He nodded once. Then we'll be ready. No bravado, no fear. Just a promise woven into the quiet. By the time the fields dried, the unspoken threads between them had tightened. Levi planted seeds alongside Emma, his hands sure as he pressed them into the soil. Hannah wore her grass bracelet until it frayed, replacing it with a strip of cloth Levi tore from an old sack. Tony showed him a rabbit trap, clumsy but functional, and Levi adjusted the twine without a word. Emma noticed how he lingered near the barn at dusk, scanning the horizon, his posture coiled. One evening, she joined him there, handing him a cup of weak coffee. "You still think about leaving?" she asked. He stared at the hills, their edges soft in the fading light. No, the answer came simple, final. She let the words settle, then said, "Good." They stood until the stars rose, two figures anchored by something neither could name. But peace on the prairie was fragile, and a storm always found a way back. Dust rose on the horizon, a thin, jagged line of riders cutting across the ridge like a scar against the sky. Emma stood on the porch, squinting against the glare of midday. Her hands tightened around the hammer she'd been using to mend the chicken coop, its weight familiar, its handle worn smooth by labor. Levi straightened beside her, his posture shifting from quiet labor to coiled readiness. Without a word, he passed the hammer to Tony, who stood nearby, wide-eyed and silent. "Inside," Levi said, his voice low but firm. Emma ushered the children into the cabin, Hannah clutching her wooden rabbit, Tony hesitating until she pushed him gently toward the door. The air felt heavier, charged with the stillness before a storm, though no clouds gathered. The riders arrived in a cloud of dust, 3 men on travel-worn horses, rifles slung across their backs. Their faces were sun-weathered, eyes sharp as flint. The oldest, a wiry man with a rifle scar running from his ear to his jaw, dismounted first. Tracking a Comanche raider, he said, his gaze flicking to Levi, who stood motionless by the porch steps. "Your neighbor Amos said you're hiding him." Emma folded her arms, her voice steady. "I took a no-raider, only a traveler, sick from the storm." The broad-shouldered man spat into the dirt. "Lady, we know what he is." Levi stepped forward then, unarmed, his stance neither defiant nor submissive, just certain. "I am who you seek," he said. The men reached for their weapons. Emma moved before they could draw, planting herself between them and Levi. "He's helped my children," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut steel. "Saved my chickens. Built that fence you're leaning on." The older man frowned, his eyes lingering on the sturdy rails behind him. "We'll be back with more," he warned. "Better bring shovels," Emma replied, her voice cold. "You'll need him if you try taking him." They rode off in a swirl of dust and muttered threats, the youngest glancing back once before vanishing over the ridge. That night, after the children slept in the root cellar, Emma found Levi sharpening a knife by the fire. Her voice was quiet but raw. "You were going to give yourself up." He didn't look up, just nodded once. "I've lived hunted. I know what ends come." She snapped, anger masking the ache in her chest. "You're not alone anymore." He paused, the blade still in his hand, then spoke without turning. "You think they won't come back?" She knelt beside him, her voice softening. "I know they will, but you won't face it alone. None of us will." Outside, the wind howled, but the fire between them burned steady. For the first time, Levi let the silence stretch without fleeing it. He handed her the knife, hilt first. "Nama," he said, enough. She took it, nodding. Not an end, but a beginning. By dawn, the ridge was quiet again, but the weight of impending storm lingered. Levi spent the day reinforcing the barn, teaching Tony how to set snares, carving Hannah a wooden bird to replace the one she'd lost. Emma watched him move through the yard, his hands sure, his presence anchoring the land itself. When she joined him at dusk, handing him a bowl of stew, he said only, "They'll come." She met his gaze. "Then we'll be ready. No bravado, no fear, Just the unspoken vow that this place, these people, were his now, and they would fight for him. The wind carried the scent of rain that night, thick and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, a warning, a promise. The storm was coming, but for now, the firelight held it at bay. Inside, the children slept, unaware of the tension woven into the air. Emma sat by the hearth, her hands idle, her mind racing. Levi leaned against the wall, his breathing slow, his eyes never fully closing. They shared the silence like a pact, each guarding the other's thoughts. The fire dimmed, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts of the past. Neither spoke, but the unspoken truth hung between them. When the riders returned, there would be no turning back. Survival had always been a solitary act, but now it was a shared burden, a fragile thread stretched taut between them. By morning, the horizon was clear, but the memory of hooves lingered in the dust. Levi checked the barn doors again, his movements methodical, his focus sharp. Emma tended to the chickens, her gaze drifting to the ridge every few minutes. The land felt smaller, as if the world had narrowed to this patch of earth, and the battle would soon bear. Hannah carved her name into the wooden bird, Tony watching in quiet imitation. They didn't ask questions, but their silence was a language of its own, a trust that whatever came next, they would face it together. When the thunder rolled again, closer this time, Emma turned to Levi. "You'll stay?" she asked, the words barely above a whisper. He looked at her, his amber eyes steady. "I stay." The promise was simple, but it rooted her in a way nothing else could. The storm was coming, but so was the fight. And for the first time, neither of them would face it alone. Dawn broke too quiet. No bird song, no rustle of wind through the brittle grass. The sky hung pale and heavy, a sheet of unbroken gray that pressed down on the land like a hell breath. Levi moved silently around the barn, oiling hinges until they groaned less, clearing the back exit of loose tools and debris. His hands worked with purpose, steady despite the tension coiled in his shoulders. Emma stood at the kitchen basin, her palms braced on the wooden rim, staring at the empty stretch beyond the fence. Her reflection wavered in the water, a face etched with lines she hadn't noticed forming. The stillness unnerved her more than shouts would have. Quiet meant waiting. Waiting meant danger was already near. Hoofbeats cracked the stillness, a slow, deliberate rhythm that grew louder until the first rider emerged from the dust. 6, 7 men followed, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon. Amos rode at the front, his posture stiff-backed, smugness clinging to him like cologne. Behind him, Micah Blackscar pulled taut across his jaw as he scanned the yard, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. The others, farmers, traders, men who'd once tipped their hats to Emma, but now rode with grim faces spread out behind them. Their eyes held no malice, only the dull resolve of those who'd been told what to fear. Emma stepped outside, rifle in hand, its weight familiar. Levi joined her, his patched shirt catching the weak morning light, the fabric frayed but intact. Amos called out first, his voice carrying the condescension of a man who'd never doubted his own rightness. "You had your warning. This is your last." Emma's grip tightened on the rifle, though her voice stayed calm, sharp as a blade. "You bring all these men to kill one? Or did you come for me too?" Micah spoke next, his tone smoother, almost gentle. "Step aside, ma'am. This don't have to go bad." Emma's laugh was short, bitter. "You mean it won't go bad for you?" She stepped forward, the rifle steady. "He is my own." The words hung in the air, a declaration that brooked no argument. Inside the cabin, Hannah cried and hushed, trembling sobs, clutching the wooden rabbit Levi had carved. Tony clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened, his small frame rigid as Emma kissed their foreheads and whispered, "Stay low. Don't move until I say." Outside, a rider shifted, his hand drifting toward his rifle. The barn door burst open with a splintering crack. Levi moved like a man unburdened, his knife flashing in the dull light before thudding into the dirt at the rider's feet, a peace offering, a warning, a line drawn in the sand. "I will not run," he said, his voice carrying the weight of every border he'd ever crossed. "But I will not be taken." Amos's face twisted, his hand jerking upward to level his rifle. The gunshot cracked before anyone could breathe. Emma fired first. The bullet carved through Amos's hat, sending it spinning into the dust. Micah's horse reared, snorting at the smell of gunpowder. "Shoot again," Emma warned, her voice cold as flint. "And the new one finds your heart." Silence followed, thick and electric. Levi stood motionless, his hands open, palms out, though his eyes tracked every rider like a hawk measuring distance. Hannah's muffled cry drifted from the cellar, and Emma's resolve hardened. This was not about raiders or revenge. It was about the child who'd placed her trust in a stranger's hands, the boy who'd learned to tie knots from him, the woman who'd found a partner in the quiet spaces between survival and grief. The riders shifted uneasily, their unity fraying. Micah spat, his voice sharp. "You're choosing him over your own." Emma stepped closer, her rifle unwavering. "He is my own, and you'll leave here, or you'll leave here broken." The dust swirled, caught between the weight of the moment and the wind rising off the plains. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, a lone voice in the growing storm. The line had been drawn. The question was who would cross it first. Chaos erupted in a burst of dust and gunfire. Levi moved like a shadow, tackling a rider mid-mount, the rifle but slamming into his temple with a sickening crack. Emma fired warnings, fast, precise, deliberate, bullets kicking up dirt near hooves and boots. Men scattered like startled crows, pride trailing behind them like torn flags. Micah cursed, reining his horse hard, spittle flying as he spat. "We'll be back." Emma leveled her rifle, eyes cold as flint. "No, you are." The words hung heavy, final. Silence settled, thick as molasses, broken only by the whimper of a wounded horse and the groan of the wind. Dust swirled, settling slowly, revealing the scars carved into the earth, bullet holes, hoof prints, the dent in the porch rail where a shot had struck. The children burst from the cellar, Hannah's small frame colliding with Levi's side. She threw her arms around him, her face buried in his shirt, tears smudging the dust on his chest. He froze, half a breath too late, then laid a hand gently on her head, fingers brushing her curls like he feared she might vanish. Tony clung to Emma's waist, his fists knotted in her skirts, his voice trembling. "Did we win?" Emma knelt, cupping his face. "We survived." Later, they buried the fight, not bodies, but the evidence of survival. Levi filled cracks in the earth with steady hands, Emma patching the barn wall where splinters jutted like broken teeth. They swept the porch, scrubbed blood from the steps, and stacked firewood neatly by the hearth. No words passed between them, only shared glances that carried the weight of what they'd faced. That night, they built a fire in the yard, flames licking at the stars. Emma sipped Corey, the bitter tang sharp on her tongue, and offered the mug to Levi. He took it, sipped once, winced. "Too bitter," he muttered, handing it back. She smiled, the corners of her eyes softening. "Tastes like peace to me." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, the children dozing on blankets nearby. Hannah's wooden rabbit lay forgotten in the grass. Tony's head lolled against Emma's shoulder. Finally, Levi broke the quiet, his voice rough as the log he leaned against. "I will build a better barn." Emma stared into the flames, their glow painting her face gold. "We'll build it together." He nodded once, the ghost of a smile tugging his lips. "Home." The word felt foreign on his tongue, but not misplaced. She echoed it, softer. "Home." In the days that followed, neighbors left gifts without knocking. A sack of flour, a jar of salt, a scrawny chicken clucking indignantly in a crate. No notes, no apologies, just quiet offerings of flour-dusted hands and averted eyes. Emma accepted each with a nod, stacking them on the shelf beside Levi's carved whistle. The barn rose anew, beams strong and true, the children nailing scraps to the walls like trophies. On a spring evening, golden lights stretched across the valley. They stood in the doorway of their new life. The air smelled of sap and turned soil, the creek humming behind the house. Emma turned to him, her hands slipping into his, callous palms fitting like pieces of a puzzle. "You changed my life," she whispered, her voice fraying at the edges. He shook his head, thumb brushing her knuckles. "You saved mine." The sun dipped low, setting fire to the horizon, blush pink and smoldering orange. A hawk circled above the ridge, its cry distant. Something in the wind sounded like a lullaby, soft and endless. Hannah hummed a tuneless song by the fire, Tony chasing fireflies in the dusk. Emma leaned into Levi's side, his arms slipping around her shoulders. They stood until the stars emerged, two figures anchored by the fire that remained, not of destruction, but of warmth, of memory, of a future etched into the land they'd claimed together.